At its core, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about two narratives, two nationalisms, and one piece of territory. And the challenge, and it's a challenge that hasn't been met, is how you accommodate those nationalisms and those narratives in a single piece of territory. The two-state solution is shorthand for an approach to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Essentially, there's a single state right now called Israel, a Jewish state, and the idea is that in land now occupied by Israel, you'd create a second state, a Palestinian state, and that would be the basis of a long-term resolution of the conflict. That's the idea, but going from that general idea to specifics is an enormous leap. There are those Palestinians who don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution called Palestine. There are those Israelis who don't want there to be a second state called Palestine. And even those on both sides who like the idea, in principle, of a two-state solution, they have not been able to come to agreement on the specific terms. When asked about milestones, the first thing that's hard to avoid is how many of the milestones have to do with conflicts. 1948, when Israel was created, the 1967 war, the 1973 war, the Intifada, and so forth. The other thing, though, that's hard to avoid is that you can't speak of a single set of milestones. Each side has its narrative, and that tells you something about their view of history. Many people are familiar with the phrase, the right of self-determination, and the idea that people who didn't have a country of their own would be able to get one. The problem when you try to apply this principle to the Israeli-Palestinian problems, you've only got one piece of territory. Some Palestinians say, we also enjoy the right of self-determination. But Israelis would say, no, we're already here, and this is something that has to be worked out through compromise. At the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, the phrase that was used is not that the Palestinians had the right of self-determination, but rather that the Palestinians had the right to participate in the determination of their own future. And implicit in that was the idea that this was not a unilateral exercise of rights by the Palestinians. This was a shared situation. Palestinians had a voice, but so too did Israelis. In any peace process, there's often a distinction between interim arrangements and final status arrangements. And final status arrangements are kind of what they sound like. It's the end result of a peace process. One of the final status issues that would have to be resolved between Israelis and Palestinians is not simply whether you have a Palestinian state, but what would be the borders. There is a fairly broad consensus that the size of that state would have to be equal to land that Palestinians lived on that was controlled by Egypt in the case of the Gaza Strip and Jordan in the case of the West Bank before the 1967 war. Now, if there were any adjustments to be made, for example, to accommodate certain blocks of Israeli settlements, there would have to be what are called land swaps. Equivalent amounts of territory would have to be found and made part of any new Palestinian state in order to compensate for any land given up to accommodate changing demographics because of the Israeli settlements. Settlements were initially outposts, became communities, towns, cities that were created in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 1967. Some are on the Golan Heights that Israel conquered in the Six-Day War. Most, however, are in the West Bank. A few were in Gaza, but no longer. And hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens now live in these settlements. Would they be allowed to stay? If so, would these people be citizens of Israel, a Palestinian entity? How would they be protected? Would they be forced to leave? What then would be the compensation provided to them? So all this has to be determined. There's a lot of focus on the borders of a Palestinian state, but at least as important is what the Palestinians would be allowed to do within their territory in the area of security. What kinds of police forces and military forces might they be allowed? What would be the size? What would be the capability? Would they be allowed to operate near the Israeli border or only away from the Israeli border? Would Israelis be allowed to keep their own security forces inside a Palestinian state to deal with potential terrorist attacks or to deal with the potential use of Palestinian territory by other forces? At the time of the creation of Israel, the Jewish state, there were Jewish settlers, and there were Palestinians living on land that today we would call Israel. Many of those Palestinians left. Some would say they were forced out, they were intimidated by various armed groups. Others would say they left at the urging of their own leaders on the promise that they would be able to return once the territory were liberated. So you have two very different narratives of how this large population of Palestinian refugees was brought about. Since then, you've had several generations. One of the big questions is, if you were to have a Palestinian state, what would be the quote-unquote right of these people to return? How many might be allowed to go back there? How many might be allowed to go back to what is Israel? Would there be compensation for those who did not, who would provide that compensation? So all of that is to be determined. And what will ultimately be the political status of Jerusalem? The Middle East is usually known as a part of the world defined by sensitive topics. Within that, Jerusalem is one of the most sensitive. It's a city that's holy and special to three faiths, to Christianity, to Islam, and to Judaism. Before 1967, Jews were denied access to the holy sites of their religion when the city was under Jordanian control. So for Israelis, it is impossible to ever imagine an outcome where Jerusalem would ever again be divided, where Jews and Israelis could not have access to their holy sites. For Palestinians, however, when they think about a Palestinian state, they want Jerusalem to be its capital. So one of the obvious questions is, how can a city that is capital to a Jewish state called Israel, and that from Israeli point of view could never again be divided, also be somehow the capital of a Palestinian entity? So this is one of the issues that forms part of the so-called final status set of issues, and it's a political issue on one hand, but on the other hand, it's a religious issue. And it's very hard to compromise when it comes to things to do with faith.